All right, chapter 24, section H, miracles of mechanization. Okay, so before the Civil War in 1860, the United States ranked fourth when it came to manufacturing goods. However, by 1894, we were number one in the world when it came to manufacturing. So the question there is, why? What shifted? What changed? Well, one thing is that some people during the Civil War had made some money, right? We see a lot of profiteering. So now that they had money, they could invest that back into the U.S. economy, especially in manufacturing. Also, we see a lot of foreign investments coming in, especially from Britain. And these foreign investors would let the Americans run the business. They just gave them the money, let the Americans run the business, and the only time they would really ever interfere was if there was an economic crisis. So we get a lot of investments both domestically and internationally as well. We see a lot of innovations in transportation, and because we have better transportation, it's easier and more cost effective to move around some of America's natural resources, right? We get a lot of coal, a lot of oil, a lot of iron, and now we're able to actually transport that in a cost effective way to factories. Another reason, for this change was America was becoming very integrated, right? We're not just regions anymore. We're kind of in it together. So America as a whole became this huge market, a huge place to sell stuff, people to sell stuff to. And this, vast market led to mass production of goods. Okay, so this huge market really enhanced America's inclination towards the mass production of goods because there was a huge market to sell to. Anyone who had an appealing new product that could sell it at a good price in large quantities and who could market it well oftentimes thrived, really made a fortune. And it all kind of, came down to this American system where we'd use machines to create interchangeable parts. Remember we talked about that a little bit with the rifles, how they were that was a new idea, using machines so that if your trigger was broken on your gun, you could go and buy a new trigger. So that whole idea of mass production, interchangeable parts, was really kind of an American idea. Of course, the big name when it comes to this is Henry Ford. Henry Ford, had his assembly line, interchangeable parts up and down. His whole car was interchangeable parts. His Model T was the big product he was creating. So it was the big idea of, standardization through machines, and then machines would actually replace skilled labor. So we saw that shift. Unfortunate, fortunate, whatever you want to say, that shift happened at this time. Okay, and the idea was too that we were replacing skilled laborers, but we also needed unskilled laborers. People that didn't necessarily have a craft, and we got those unskilled laborers from an increase once again in immigration. Lots of immigration. It really fueled this shift we see in America. All right. We see also at this time just business operations as a whole, they're facilitated by machines. We see cash registers, we see typewriters, we see stock tickers. All of these things are invented to help along the growth of industry, the growth of the business. We see between 1860 to 1890, 440,000 patents were issued. 440,000, I should say, patents were issued. We see Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 introduced the telephone to America, and America invested in building this gigantic network to make the telephone system work in America. And women started to get jobs then working as telephone operators, working the switchboards. Another huge invention at this time comes to us from Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison perfected the electric light bulb, right? He's the guy who is famous for saying, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. A little nugget of wisdom free to you from Thomas Edison. Anyway, just a kind of random fact about him. He was severely deaf, so he had profound hearing loss. So this profound hearing loss actually caused him to be more focused because he had less distractions. So the light bulb really changed America. So Americans before this time, they were used to they would get about 9 hours of sleep a night. But now that the light bulb allowed them to work later into the night, Americans now had 2 hours less, or about 7 hours of sleep every night. Okay, section I. The trust titans emerge. All right. Ooh, titans of industry coming our way. Well, the titans of industry, they really worked hard to get rid of competition. They hated competition because if you had competition, you had to lower the price of your goods, right? So if there's store A, store B selling the same can of soup, you have to lower your price hoping people will come to your store. That sort of idea, right? So competition is hated by industry titans, okay? And we're going to really speak about 3 big names, okay? Briefly here, we have Andrew Carnegie, and he's going to be the Steel King. We have John D. Rockefeller, and he's going to be our oil guy. And then we have J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan's going to be, the bank's banker. Okay, so to remember that, think of Andrew Carnegie, cars made out of steel, although they're not now. So Carnegie, he was the steel guy, cars made out of steel. Rockefeller is the oil guy. Think that you have to dig through a lot of rock to get to oil. And then J.P. Morgan, he was our really wealthy banker. Think of Morgan money banking. Okay, so that's how I remember it. Take it if you will. Okay, so we're going to kind of look at each one of these titans here. And each titan kind of had their specific economic strategy they used. And we'll explain those as well. So we'll start with our Steel King. Okay, Andrew Carnegie. He didn't invent, but he really used the idea of vertical integration. So this is the term you should connect with Carnegie. Vertical integration. Okay, vertical integration is when you combined into one organization all the phases of manufacturing. So for Carnegie, remember, he's the steel guy. He owned every step of the process, okay? He owned the mines that dug the ore, okay? He owned the transportation or the railroads that shipped his ore. He owned the refineries, okay? He marketed his products, so he owned every single step of the process to make steel. So that's called vertical integration, where you are an owner of every single step in the process to make your goods. And that was good because it was efficient, right? You're eliminating any fees you would have to pay to middlemen. You can control the quality of your product. You can control the supply, so you can control how much ore is mined, for example, and just very, very efficient. So if any of these 3 titans were to be considered a nice guy, Carnegie would be kind of the nice guy. Okay. Next we get to Rockefeller. Okay, Rockefeller, thinking you have to dig through rock to get to oil. Rockefeller was our oil guy. Okay, and he used the idea of horizontal integration, right? Horizontal integration. And what that was is the idea that you would make allies with your competitors. So instead of working against your competitors, you would become their buddies, that sort of thing. And together, you and your buddies would create a monopoly on a given market. Okay, and Rockefeller was the master of this. Okay, he created his company was called Standard Oil. Okay, Standard Oil created a trust, And a trust goes hand in hand with the idea of horizontal integration, or kind of buddying up with your competitors. And what it is, how like at least Rockefeller used it, is that smaller stockholders or stockholders in smaller oil companies would assign their stock to the board of directors of Standard Oil. So what that would really mean is Standard Oil is this big giant company, and what it would do is if there was a smaller company that was starting to compete with them, instead of, crushing them or competing with them, they would assume it. Okay? They would assign their stock to their board of directors, so they would assume it. So instead of being in competition with these smaller oil companies, they would kind of assume it. They would group together. Okay, they would work together. So that's the idea of horizontal integration, allying with your competitors. And when you do that, when you kind of merge these groups together, that's called a trust. Yeah. All right. So finally, last but not least, we get to J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan, the economic term you should kind of relate or connect with him is the idea of interlocking directorates. I didn't say that right, but that's okay. Directorates. Okay, interlocking directorates. It's not that complicated. I guess I just can't pronounce words. Okay, so this was a scheme, the interlocking directorates was a scheme to eliminate competition. So kind of like a trust, you wanted to eliminate competition, but they approached this slightly differently. What they did is the boards of directors, the group in charge of each company, or the board of directors of different companies, maybe in the same industry, would have enough members in common to ensure that companies are under the same control and to reduce competition. So it's kind of the idea of making friends with your competition, but how they would do that is to make sure that there was some interlocking or overlapping between members of the boards. So say there's 5 people, of course there's more than 5, but just for example's sake, say there's 5 people on the board of industry A, and there's 5 people on the board of industry B. Well, maybe 3 of those people are the same, or they share 3 of the same people. That way they make sure that the 2 companies, instead of butting heads, really work together, and that helps to reduce competition, that helps to raise prices, gets more money in the pocket of J.P. Morgan. Great. Section J, the supremacy of steel. Woo! I always think of like Man of Steel, right? Superman? Anyway, steel is king. Let it be known. Corn is no longer king. Cotton is no longer king, I should say. Steel is king now. And steel is something that's called a capital good. Okay, we're using a lot of economic terms in this chapter because this chapter is all about economics. Well, So steel is a capital good. Okay, a capital good is a good that is used in the production of other goods. So a capital good is not something you sell directly to the consumer in Walmart. No, a capital good is a good you sell to a factory, and then that factory turns that into the manufactured goods that appear at Walmart. They didn't have Walmarts back then, but that's okay. Steel was used in the production of a lot of things, from railroads to skyscrapers. Back in the day, America had been built from wood, brick, and iron because steel was simply too expensive. When Cornelius Vanderbilt, we talked about him a little bit earlier, when he started using steel rails for his railroad, he actually had to import that from Europe just because, there was no market for it in America, so Americans were not producing steel. However, that changed. Okay, by 1890, America was producing more than a third of the world's supply of steel, and the shift, I should say, happened when Henry Bessemer created a process that made it very inexpensive to create steel, or a cheap way of creating steel. Okay, so this was called the Bessemer process. Henry Bessemer created it. And what they would do, I don't know the logistics of this by any means, but it was a method where they would remove the impurities from iron by blowing air through molten iron. So they would heat up the iron nice and hot so it was like melting, and then they would blow air through it using compressors. They blow air through it, and somehow, some way, that took the impurities out of the iron and helped make steel inexpensively. Good job, Henry. You know what you're doing. Section K. Carnegie and other sultans of steel. Okay, still on the steel track. No pun intended. Okay, let's talk about Andrew Carnegie. Remember, if out of the three titans we're going to talk about today, Carnegie could be considered to be, like the nice guy. Okay, here's his story. He was born in Scotland and came to the U.S. when he was 13 with his family. But he quickly worked his way up the ladder and finally entered the steel business in Pittsburgh. And he was really gifted as being a very good organizer, being very efficient. Remember, we talked about his idea of vertical integration, cutting out all the middlemen, making it, run like clockwork. He really disliked these trusts. Remember, these kind of companies that were grouping together to eliminate competition. He really, kind of distrusted them. He wasn't a fan of the trusts. But by 1900, he was producing about a fourth of all the nation's steel. And this is before income tax days. So he pocketed about $25 million a year. So he had a good business going there. Okay. Eventually, Andrew Carnegie, he wants to retire. And so he wants to sell his, holdings in the steel company. The thing is, who's going to buy it, right? It's kind of a very expensive purchase to make, to sell out, all of Carnegie's holdings. So Carnegie wants J.P. Morgan, our banker, to buy all of the stock he has in steel. Okay. And, long story short, J.P. Morgan decides to buy all of it. So in the end, Morgan buys Carnegie's holdings for about $400 million. So Carnegie is sitting pretty, right? Carnegie just got $400 million in his pocket. And what he does is he spends the rest of his life giving it away. You'll see a lot of times Carnegie libraries. The town I grew up in had a Carnegie library. So he gave money to build libraries. He gave money for pensions or a retirement fund for professors. When all was said and done, out of the $400 million he received, he gave away about $350 million. Okay, so now that Morgan more or less has all of Carnegie's steel in his hand, what he does is he creates America's first billion-dollar corporation, and this is called U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel will come about again later on, but that's kind of important to know. Billion-dollar company in America, kind of a big deal. U.S. Steel, and that is when Morgan takes all of Carnegie's holdings and creates this giant steel company. Next section, Section L. Rockefeller grows an American beauty rose. It rhymes, and it will make sense in just a little bit. All right, so besides the steel industry really booming after the Civil War, we also see the emergence of an oil industry. Okay, so in 1859 we see the first oil well being dug in Pennsylvania. This well is called Drake's Folly, and it really just pours out black gold, right, oil. And the thing is, at first the oil industry wasn't focused around cars. Okay, cars haven't really been invented yet. Really what it focuses around is producing kerosene, because kerosene is used to light kerosene lamps. So kerosene is really the product being made or produced from the oil. The lamps had a much brighter flame than the whale oil lamps of old. Okay, so by 1870, kerosene was America's fourth most valuable export. kind of a big deal. However, the kerosene industry kind of went away when we see Edison's light bulb really taking a hold. Okay, so the light bulb really displaces kerosene in the market. So for a while, the oil industry is kind of put to the side, not a big deal. However, things definitely change with the invention of the internal combustion engine, aka the car or the automobile. Okay, revolutionizes the oil industry. Now it's not just for kerosene; it's a big deal. Okay, and this is where John D. Rockefeller, remember, have to dig through rock to get to oil. Rockefeller really comes to dominate the oil industry. Rockefeller, his story, he grew up in a poor family, became a successful businessman at the age of 19, and his company was Standard Oil. We talked about that a little bit before, but Standard Oil Company is what he built. And he really built it into one of these huge trusts, right? So combining a bunch of oil companies together. So he built Standard Oil into this huge trust. And for him, he was no Carnegie, right? Ethics in business didn't really exist for him. By 1877, however, he controlled about 95% of all the U.S. oil refineries. So he had a lot of power. And the section title is Rockefeller Grows an American Beauty Rose. And the phrase American Beauty Rose comes from an analogy Rockefeller's son gives trying to explain his father's, kind of aggressive path. And what that quote is this. Okay, here we go. Quote, American Beauty Rose can only be produced by sacrificing the early buds that grew around it. So in his mind, he's saying that he had to kind of snip away all of these little industries or all of these little rosebuds in order for something as beautiful as Standard Oil to be produced. And like I said, Rockefeller, he's no Carnegie, he's not a saint. He hires spies, he receives a lot of kickbacks from the railroads that ship his oil, that sort of thing. And he justifies his actions by saying, if I didn't do it, someone else would have. The time was ripe for this aggressive like consolidation or partnership of companies together. So when all is said and done, Rockefeller's oil monopoly did create a superior product at a relatively cheap price. So it did work out when all was said and done. A lot of corruption involved, however. Okay, because like Walmart, right, the larger the quantity, the more cost effectively you can create a product. So, a lot of expensive machines were used to refine the oil. So this huge expense called for a huge company to bear that load. So the expensive machinery called for bigness and for consolidation. Okay, so besides we saw some of these trusts growing, right? We saw U.S. Steel was growing very large. We saw Standard Oil was growing very large, but the trust building did not stop there. Okay, we get a sugar trust, a tobacco trust, a leather trust. These were happening all over the place. We get our meat kings, our cattle guys, Gustafson Swift and Philip Armour. And we see kind of this new class of new money sprouting out. The newly rich are starting to eclipse the people who had old money, okay, or the old aristocracy. So it's not surprising that those who really crusaded against the trusts were men who were from old money families that had been around for a while, that were used to having a lot of prestige, and they didn't like to be usurped by all of these young kids, all of these new money folks. So a lot of these old money folks really started to go after the trusts because they didn't want to lose their influence or their prestige. Okay, section M, the gospel of wealth. All right, so back in the day, we have the idea of the divine right to rule. Kings and queens would say, I have the God-given right to rule. Well, that idea kind of slipped its way into American industry. People, especially Carnegie, felt that they had their God had given them their wealth, their riches. So Carnegie felt that he had the moral imperative, the moral responsibility to use his God-given wealth well. Okay, and there's another philosophy here about wealth. Okay, we have the idea of the gospel of wealth. God gave me the wealth, I need to make use of it. And then kind of on the other spectrum, we get something called social Darwinism. Okay, social Darwinism is the idea that individuals got to where they were by competing with their natural talents. The wealthy had more money simply because they had more abilities. It was natural. And although this idea is called social Darwinism, it really has less to do with Charles Darwin and more to do with a couple of British laissez-faire economists, I should say. And their names were David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus. Okay, so Ricardo and Malthus thought that, millionaires were the product of natural selection. You got to where you were because of the talents you had. So social Darwinism really connected with these British economists. I can't pronounce words. Anyway, the idea was, a lot of these new rich folks had really pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. A lot of them had humble beginnings and, really built a great empire of wealth. So the idea was, the poor are poor simply because they're lazy. It's their own fault that they're poor. I started off poor and look where I am now. So that was kind of the mindset that was going on with social Darwinism. An example of social Darwinism was someone called Reverend Russell Conwell. So Reverend Conwell was from Philadelphia, and he became rich by giving a lecture thousands and thousands of times across the country. And this lecture was called Acres of Diamonds. And he really echoed the ideas of Ricardo and Malthus. He said, there is not a poor person in the United States who is not made poor by his own shortcomings. So this idea of social Darwinism was really preached even from the pulpit throughout the country. Okay, and because of this idea, it's, the poor people, it's their own fault, they're poor. It was really a roadblock to any social reforms that may have come about at this time. All right. Last kind of thing in this section, we have to recognize the fact that a lot of these titans of industry really used the Constitution to back themselves up. To escape regulations from the states, to allow themselves to keep going on the path they're going on. They really use the Constitution in their favor. A couple of examples of this is the fact that Giant Trust really loved the fact that the Constitution says that interstate commerce, anything really to do with railroads, was controlled by Congress and not the states. They liked that. And another part of the Constitution they really kind of warped into their own interpretation was the 14th Amendment. Okay, if you remember from a couple chapters ago, the 14th Amendment was the amendment to the Constitution that gave or tried to ensure civil rights for the newly emancipated blacks, kind of preventing the states from taking away their rights. However, corporate lawyers, being very clever, kind of twisted and argued that a corporation, like a trust, should be considered a person. And because corporations are considered people under the 14th Amendment, a corporation couldn't be deprived of its property by a state without the due process of law. So they were really hiding behind the 14th Amendment to get away from state regulation. All right, and also a lot of states, chose to incorporate, legally speaking, or chose to form in states that were really lax on regulation anyway. So states like New Jersey hardly had any regulations. So a lot of corporations, to kind of escape from under the thumb of states, they went and formally incorporated into states that didn't have a lot of regulation. All right, last section for this video. Section N, government tackles the trust evil. Okay, so remember, people are starting to begin to mobilize against these monopolies, and at first they kind of tried at the state level. A lot of Western farmers were complaining because of the Depression, but we see that, it doesn't work at the state level, so they have to appeal it to the federal government. So what the federal government does, in 1890, they passed something called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, even the title should give away a little bit of what it is: antitrust, against these big trusts. And what it was, it's a law that forbid the creation of trusts. Technically speaking, the wording actually is, it forbids the combinations in restraint of trade. Combinations and restraint of trade. So really it's saying trusts are not okay with us. And it was really a landmark act of Congress, because it was one of the first attempts by Congress to regulate big business for the protection of the public good. However, just like the ICC we saw earlier, it really proved to be ineffective. It really did. Corporate lawyers found loopholes so they could kind of get around this Sherman Antitrust Act. And at first the act really was used only to curb labor unions, so kind of an unintended consequence of this act was really curbing the labor unions. But in 1914, so years later, Congress revised it so it could be more effective against monopolies. So until this time, it was kind of the question. It was unclear, was the government in control of the trusts, or was the trust in control of the government? Yep. So with that, I think we will stop for now.